What if the oldest human story is not hidden in a ruin, but in a blank space, an empty latitude where the record goes pale, where maps once drew certainty and later editions quietly withdrew their ink? Hyperborea arrives like that, not as a place one can point to with confidence, but as a name that keeps returning whenever the world feels unfinished, whenever the archive seems to have lost a page. And before you let your body sink completely into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm saying makes you want to stay a little longer. If you want, share your location and the time you're listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting through the night with me. In the oldest European literature, Hyperborea is not introduced with a surveyor's tone. It drifts in as a rumor from the edge of known winds. The Greeks spoke of Boreas, the north wind, and Hyperborea was, by the logic of language, beyond it, beyond the wind that numbed the hands, beyond the season that killed crops, beyond the reach of ordinary roads. That is the first difficulty. The very name is relational. It points away from the familiar, not toward coordinates. And yet, for centuries, that word behaved strangely. It did not vanish after a single mention. It kept reappearing in poems, geographies, myths, and later in maps. Sometimes it was treated as a sacred elsewhere, sometimes as a distant region of unusual light, sometimes as an imagined refuge. The sources do not agree, and the disagreements matter. When accounts conflict, it often means someone is seeing with different eyes, or seeing different things and using the same name. The central contradiction begins here, quietly, without drama. If Hyperborea was only a poetic device, an emblem of far away, it should have remained in the realm of metaphor. It should not have pressed so insistently into descriptions of roots, offerings, temples, and winds. But if Hyperborea was a real location, even loosely, then the next question becomes difficult. Why does the record never resolve into something stable? Why does it never become a settled province of history the way Egypt, Persia, or Scythia eventually did in the Mediterranean imagination? There are cultures that were once half legend, half report, and then gradually came into focus as trade widened and travel became routine. Hyperborea never quite does. It hovers, it recedes. It feels, at times, like a corridor that should lead somewhere but ends in a sealed door. There are modern reasons for this. The far north was, for many ancient writers, outside practical experience. Much of what was known came through secondhand travel narratives, and those narratives were filtered through languages and agendas. Early ethnography could be more literary than empirical. Sometimes it was sincere, sometimes it was decorative. The temptation is to file Hyperborea away under the same label as other distant marvels: land of long lived people, land of perpetual day. That would be tidy, and the night likes tidy things. But the problem with tidy things is that they rarely explain the persistence of a name across changing intellectual climates. Classical authors did not all write for the same purpose. Some cared about marvels, others about geography, others about cult practice and origin stories. A single invented paradise would be expected to remain consistent, or at least to fade as knowledge grew. Instead, Hyperborea transforms. It migrates across genres. It slips into the background of serious works and then surfaces again in unexpected places, sometimes beside real landmarks. This is where the investigation begins, not by claiming a hidden civilization, not by insisting on a lost polar empire, but by watching how a name travels. When a name survives, it is often because it is doing work. It is pointing to something unresolved in the collective mind, a direction of longing, a boundary of fear, a gap in the map where someone suspects there should be land, or meaning, or origin. There's also a second contradiction, quieter still. The modern world has mapped the Arctic with satellites and icebreakers. It knows the anatomy of coasts and the slow fracture of sea ice. It knows the drift patterns, the auroral rings, the deep basins. This knowledge does not easily accommodate the older images of a temperate northern sanctuary, or a central polar landmass that appears in certain early modern maps. The older maps are not evidence of Hyperborea as fact, they are evidence of something else. A historical moment when uncertainty was drawn as certainty, when the unknown was filled in with geometry and suggestion. Why did cartographers do that? Sometimes it was a tradition of speculative geography. Sometimes it was an attempt to make sense of fragments, reports of islands, mistaken coastlines, tales of open water beyond ice. Sometimes it was inherited from classical ideas about balance and symmetry on the globe. Sometimes it was the simple human impulse to refuse blankness. Blankness, however, is not empty. Blankness is where the mind projects its most persistent shapes. The case of Hyperborea sits in that tension. Ancient words and later lines on paper, poetry and cartography, mythic distance in the physical north. And layered through it all is a pattern that feels familiar to anyone who has spent time with the edges of history. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and perhaps more troubling. It is the way archives lose what they cannot classify. The way institutions preserve what fits a catalog and neglect what sits awkwardly between disciplines. The way a story that cannot be tested becomes either entertainment or embarrassment, rarely a serious question. A legend is admitted into the museum only when it has been safely disarmed. So the approach, for now, remains restrained. The investigation treats Hyperborea as an anomaly in the record, an enduring label for North beyond North, and asks what can be responsibly said about the clues associated with it. Not clues in the sense of certainty, but clues in the sense of recurring motifs that appear across time, references to extraordinary light and long days, hints of sacred roots connected to Apollo, descriptions of peoples at the edge of storms, and later, maps that place islands in continental shapes where later exploration would redraw the lines. Each motif must be handled carefully. Ancient writers sometimes use the language of the marvelous to signal moral distance, not geographic fact. Yet sometimes, embedded in the marvelous, there's a shard of observation, an awareness of seasonal daylight extremes, perhaps learned through travelers who reached high latitudes, a description of winds and cold that feels too specific to be purely decorative, a ritual detail that suggests contact, or at least a belief in contact strong enough to organize practice around it. And then there are the silences. Hyperborea is often mentioned as if it is known, and yet the sources rarely provide the kinds of logistical detail that would make it real in the way other regions are real. There are no stable lists of kings, no clear trade goods, no consistent neighboring tribes. The record grows quiet precisely where it should grow loud, where curiosity should force detail. This is not proof of anything. It is simply the shape of the gap. The gap widens when later centuries revisit the North. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, inherited classical geography mixed with new voyages and rumors. Greenland and Iceland entered European consciousness in complicated ways. Reports of islands multiplied. The far north became a theater for both ambition and confusion. In that theater, some maps drew striking forms near the pole, sometimes divided lands, sometimes a central rock, sometimes channels that seemed to imply navigable waters. These maps have histories. They were copied, revised, corrected, and sometimes quietly abandoned. A viewer can almost feel the hesitation of the pen as confidence turns into doubt. And still the name Hyperborea does not entirely disappear. It lingers as a word that refuses to die. It becomes, in some later imaginations, a symbol of origins, a cradle, a lost golden age. Scholars have argued for and against such readings. Some treat it as purely mythic. Others suggest it preserves distant memories of northern travel or of the way high latitude phenomena, like the midnight sun, might have sounded to those who lived farther south. There are debates over interpretation, and the debates themselves are part of the evidence that Hyperborea is a question that never settled. In the next movement of this investigation, the attention turns to the earliest surviving voices that spoke the name aloud in writing. Greek poets and historians who were closer to the myth's first circulation than any modern interpreter. The record there is fragmentary, sometimes quoted through later authors, sometimes preserved with cautionary notes. It is there at the beginning, that the first corridor appears, a path of words leading north, where the lamplight of certainty begins to thin, and the wind outside the archive starts to rise. The oldest mentions of Hyperborea do not sit in a single tidy manuscript. They arrive like scattered leaves found in different rooms of the same ruined house. Later writers quote earlier ones. Names echo inside names. Lines survive because someone, centuries afterward, chose to copy them into a new work. That alone is a kind of filter. It does not mean the earlier lines were false, but it does mean they were selected, kept because they served a purpose in a later argument, or because they were beautiful, or because they were useful. Among the early voices, one name appears often in the discussion: Herodotus. He did not treat Hyperborea as a place he could confirm. His tone, when it turns toward the far north, becomes careful. He describes what is said, what is rumored, what is claimed by others, and he marks the weak points. This restraint matters. It shows a mind that wanted to separate report from certainty, even when the world offered very little certainty to separate. Herodotus speaks of Scythia and the lands around it with a detail that suggests compiled testimony and, at times, direct inquiry. He knows the names of rivers, the movements of peoples, the trade in grain and slaves. But when his attention reaches beyond the northern edges of that world, the narrative begins to fray. He acknowledges stories of Hyperboreans sending offerings, sacred gifts that travel from hand to hand through a chain of peoples until they arrive in Greek sanctuaries. The detail is striking not because it proves a northern civilization, but because it sketches a mechanism, a relay of objects moving across distances too great for a single messenger. It is a mechanism that could be interpreted in several ways. Some scholars read it as an explanation myth for existing ritual objects, and attempt to give them an origin in a distant sacred elsewhere. Others point out that long distance exchange did exist across Eurasia in different periods, even if the exact routes and dates are debated. The question becomes whether the story is purely symbolic or whether it is a symbolic account built upon a faint awareness of northern trade networks. The sources thin out at the point where certainty would require names, dates, and the ordinary weight of logistics. There is another early strand, more lyrical, tied to Apollo. Hyperborea is sometimes described as a place beloved by Apollo, a land where the god spends part of the year. Here the problem grows more delicate. Divine travel is not geography, yet the pattern, Apollo leaving, Apollo returning, can be read as mythic language for seasonal cycles, light and darkness, warmth and cold, the rhythm of the year. Some interpreters suggest that the association with Apollo hints at a northern phenomenon that Mediterranean peoples found uncanny: the long daylight of summer at high latitudes and the long darkness of winter. This suggestion does not require a lost kingdom. It requires only that someone, at some time, heard credible descriptions of a world where the sun behaves differently. But even that interpretation must be held lightly. Myth can produce seasonal symbolism without any empirical trigger. Human beings watch the sky everywhere and turn it into story. Still, the North is not merely elsewhere, it is elsewhere, with measurable differences. The question is whether the ancient tradition preserved those differences, or whether later readers are projecting modern knowledge backward onto old poetry. The archive offers more fragments. The poet Pindar refers to the Hyperboreans in a tone that feels like reverence and distance. The mention is brief, but it carries a familiar scent, an idealized far land beyond hardship. Such idealization is common in ancient literature, yet Hyperborea's idealization is unusual in its direction. Many utopias are placed across the sea, toward the west, or on imagined islands. Hyperborea is placed beyond cold. It suggests a place beyond what should be survivable. That paradox, paradise beyond the killing wind, may have made the name memorable. The same paradox appears in later Greek and Roman writers in different keys, sometimes as wonder, sometimes as skepticism, sometimes as inherited convention. Over time, the name becomes a container that can hold contradictions. It can be a literal north, a moral north, a sacred north, or a poetic north. The investigation cannot treat all these as the same thing. The task is to watch when the name is used as ornament and when it is used as explanation. One clue lies in how ancient writers used the edges of the world. In Greek thought, the edges were not empty, they were charged with meaning. The farthest places were where gods and monsters lived, where origins hid, where the strange became possible. If Hyperborea belonged to that category, then its function was not to be found on a map, but to anchor a worldview, a cosmology with a center and a rim. And yet the Greeks also mapped. They drew coastlines. They estimated distances. They argued about the shape of the earth. The same culture could dream and measure in the same breath. That is why Hyperborea is so difficult to dismiss. It sits at the seam between two impulses: the poetic urge to place perfection beyond reach, and the empirical urge to convert hearsay into geography. The seam becomes visible in the way Herodotus handles the story of offerings. He describes the chain, but he also notices the absence. If Hyperborea is so close to the chain, why do the intermediaries not know more? If the offerings truly come from there, why is the trail so vague? His skepticism does not erase the story, it sharpens it. It shows that even in antiquity, some readers felt the discomfort of this half knowledge. There are also older, more elusive references often associated with Aristeas of Perconesus, a poet whose work survives only in fragments and later summaries. He wrote of distant peoples, Arimaspians, Isidones, and other names whose historical grounding remains disputed. In this mist, Hyperborea sometimes appears as part of a wider northern tapestry. But because the original poem is lost, the investigation must treat the later reports with caution. The corridor is there, but it is lined with mirrors. It is too easy to mistake reflection for substance. What can be said responsibly is this: Hyperborea enters the surviving record not as a single claim, but as a recurring motif. It is tied to sacred narratives, to stories of offerings, to seasonal myth, and to the farthest north beyond known tribes. It is also tied, almost immediately, to doubt. Some writers repeat it, some question it, some preserve it as tradition without endorsing it. The record is not one voice. It is a chorus that cannot agree on the song's origin. This is where the investigation begins to feel like standing at the mouth of a cave. The cave is not guaranteed to lead anywhere, but there are marks on the stone, repeated footsteps, repeated names, repeated gestures toward the same direction. The temptation is to stride inside and declare what must be there. The more disciplined approach is slower. It follows the marks and admits where the marks vanish. In the next movement, attention shifts from literature to the world that literature barely sketches, the actual northern environment and the ancient limits of travel. What did north mean to Mediterranean writers in different centuries? How far did contact realistically extend? And what happens to a myth when new geography begins to press against its edges? When exploration and map-making force older names to either attach themselves to real places or retreat further into silence? North is not one direction, it is a series of thresholds. The first threshold is climate, the second is language. The third is the point where familiar crops fail, where roads thin, where written records become rare, where the archive, even at its best, must rely on hearsay. Ancient Mediterranean writers did not speak of the Arctic in the modern sense. They spoke of cold lands, of Scythians, of far rivers, of islands and gray seas. They spoke of where the sun behaved strangely, where night stretched, where winds could peel skin from bone. North, for them, was not a line on a globe. It was a gradient of survivability. To investigate Hyperborea, the question becomes practical. How far north did the classical world actually reach in meaningful contact? The answer is uneven. Greek colonies dotted the Black Sea coast. Trade and conflict braided Greeks with Scythians and other steppe peoples. Farther north and west, knowledge came through intermediaries, merchants, captives, travelers, and the slow movement of goods. Direct exploration of high latitudes was rare, but not non-existent. The Mediterranean was not sealed. It was a basin connected by many narrow corridors to wider worlds. One of the more important names in this corridor is Pytheas of Massalia, the Greek explorer from the 4th century BCE, whose account is lost but widely discussed in later sources. He reportedly traveled north from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and described regions beyond Britain, including a place called Thule. the details come to us through later authors, some skeptical, some hostile. Strabo, for instance, doubted Pythias in places and criticized what he considered exaggerations. Yet other writers treated Pythias as a valuable source for northern geography. The record is again split: a report, a rebuttal, and a lingering uncertainty. This matters because it shows an ancient precedent for the kind of northward knowledge that could feed myths without fully resolving them. If Pythias reached high latitudes, he may have witnessed or heard of very long days in summer, or seas thick with something like a gelatinous mixture. Descriptions later writers sometimes mention. Modern readers debate what these descriptions correspond to: sea ice, slush, or something else. The point is not to settle that debate here, but to acknowledge that high latitude phenomena did enter classical discussion through contested travel narratives. Hyperborea, however, is not Thule. Thule is often treated in ancient geography as a far northern limit, sometimes an island, sometimes a region, sometimes a shifting placeholder. Hyperborea is beyond the north wind, a phrase that can expand without limit. Yet the two concepts can interact. As geography pushes northward, myth is pressured. Either myth attaches itself to the new frontier, or it retreats to a further one. The environment of the far north is part of the pressure. The more extreme the latitude, the more seasonal light becomes a dominant fact. At certain points, the summer sun refuses to set. In winter, darkness can dominate. This reality can be communicated secondhand. It can also be mythologized easily. A land where the sun behaves differently is fertile ground for sacred narratives. It feels like the boundary of the normal world. But there's another environmental factor: ice. Ice is not merely cold, it is a moving architecture. It changes coastlines, blocks passages, opens and closes routes. Even today, it can make navigation uncertain. In the ancient and medieval worlds, ice could be the difference between rumor and proof. A place could exist and still remain inaccessible for most of the year, its presence known only by those who lived near it or dared it in brief seasons. Knowledge of such a place might enter Southern archives as a story with sharp edges and missing middle, enough to be compelling, not enough to be verified. And then there is the question of time depth. The far north was not always the far north in the same way. Climate has shifted over millennia. The end of the last ice age and subsequent climatic fluctuations changed ecosystems and coastlines. Sea levels rose dramatically after glacial periods, reshaping shorelines and submerging land bridges. These are broad scientific facts, but their cultural implications are complicated. If older human populations lived in regions now underwater or altered, their traces may be harder to find. The archive of material culture is not neutral, it is shaped by geology and sea. This is where some researchers carefully suggest that myths of northern lands might preserve very old memories of changing landscapes, memories refracted through countless retellings. Others counter that such claims are too speculative and that myth should not be treated as a fossil record. Both positions have weight. The investigation does not need to decide immediately. It needs to understand why the debate persists. The North also brings another difficulty: literacy. Written records thin out as one moves away from the Mediterranean centers that produced and preserved manuscripts. Many Northern European societies transmitted history and myth orally for long periods. Oral tradition can preserve deep time, but it is also fluid. When later written sources capture it, they capture a moment, not the whole river. This creates a mismatch: a southern written archive encountering northern oral worlds, translating them into its own categories, sometimes flattening them, sometimes exoticizing them. If Hyperborea has any grounding beyond metaphor, it may have been fed by such mismatches. Southern descriptions of northern peoples that blend observation with interpretation. The beyond in Hyperborea could have meant beyond familiar political boundaries, beyond familiar trade routes, beyond familiar lifeways. It could have been a label applied to multiple groups at different times, the way some ancient ethnonyms were used loosely. There's also a political and psychological dimension. To place a blessed land in the far north is to invert expectation. It is to say, beyond hardship lies peace, beyond cold lies sacredness. This inversion can serve moral storytelling. It can also serve cultic geography. The association of Hyperborea with Apollo, in particular, suggests a ritual imagination in which divine movement links Greece to a distant purity. In such an imagination, the North is not empty, it is a mirror. The mirror becomes more complex when later cultures adopt and reshape the classical inheritance. Medieval and Renaissance scholars inherited Greek and Roman texts alongside biblical geography, travelers' tales, and the emerging reports of northern voyages. The far north becomes crowded with names: Thule, Ultima Thule, Hyperborea, Greenland, Islands of Rumor. Some of these names begin to overlap. Some drift apart. The same map can carry both inherited myth and new coastlines traced by sailors. It is here, in the collision of old names and new navigation, that the idea of a distinct Hyperborean region becomes newly tempting to map makers. A map is a claim of solidity. Even when it is speculative, it looks certain. The viewer's eye believes the line more easily than the text's caution. In the next movement, the investigation follows that temptation into the early modern cartographic imagination, not to treat it as proof, but to ask why certain shapes near the pole became so persistent on paper. What sources did mapmakers cite, copy, or infer? How did a rumor harden into geometry? And what does it mean when later maps quietly erase what earlier ones drew with confidence, leaving behind the faint impression of a land that once seemed to belong there? When the North becomes a drawing, it becomes persuasive. A sentence can hesitate. A map cannot easily do that. A map lays ink down with the authority of a boundary. Even when it is speculative, even when it is copied from a rumor, it arrives to the eye as a fact. This is one reason the early modern period matters for Hyperborea. It is the era when inherited classical names and newly gathered maritime reports were pressed into the same frame, and the frame demanded shape. In the 16th century, European cartography was both more ambitious and more uncertain than it often appears. The globe was being reimagined in print. Voyages were bringing back coastlines and hazards, but the high Arctic remained difficult to confirm. The result was a strange hybrid: precise depictions of some regions alongside bold conjectures near the pole. In that hybrid, the old name Hyperborea could hover near new coastlines like a ghost that refuses to choose a single grave. One of the most influential images in this tradition is associated with Gerardus Mercator. His 1569 world map is famous for its projection, but another work often discussed in this context is his later map of the Arctic, published posthumously in his atlas. In that Arctic depiction, the pole is shown with a striking arrangement: land masses and channels organized in a way that suggests an underlying plan. Near the center is sometimes described in modern commentary as a mountain or rock, with waters flowing outward through channels. The map is visually compelling, almost architectural, and it has fed many later imaginations. But the investigation must stay close to what can be responsibly said. Mercator's polar depiction was not presented as a myth illustration, it was presented as geography. And yet, the sources for such geography were often indirect. Mercator and other cartographers relied on earlier maps, travel accounts, and learned compilations. In the Arctic, where direct measurement was scarce, older legends and speculative theories could slip into the cartographic bloodstream. A name like Rupes nigra, the Black Rock, appears in discussions of the supposed central polar feature in some traditions, often connected in modern retellings to a medieval source sometimes called the Inventio Fortunata, a work that is lost and known only through later references. Because that work itself is not extant, claims about its contents are inherently uncertain and must be treated with care. What can be observed is the pattern: a lost text cited as an authority used to justify a drawing later treated as evidence. This is how corridors become self-reinforcing. A map cites a book. The book is lost, the map remains. Later, readers assume the map must have had a basis, because why else would it exist? And so the absence becomes a kind of presence, an empty shelf that still shapes belief. Other cartographers of the era, such as Abraham Ortelius, produced atlases that helped standardize geographical imagination. Their work often compiled and harmonized competing sources. In regions well traveled, this produced increasing accuracy. In the high north, it could produce an elegant uncertainty, different coastlines, different island groupings, different interpretations of what lay beyond Greenland or beyond the northern reaches of Scandinavia and Russia. The maps show a mind trying to complete a circle with missing segments. The key here is not to treat any single map as proof of a land that was there, but to treat maps as historical documents of belief, information flow, and the limits of knowledge. The Arctic in this period was not only a physical region, it was an intellectual frontier. It was where cosmological ideas about symmetry and balance could still breathe. It was also where practical hopes, new trade routes, passages to Asia, created incentives to imagine navigable channels. The famous dream of a Northwest Passage and other northern routes shaped exploration and, in turn, shaped cartography. A map could become a promise as much as a record. Hyperborea, in this environment, becomes less a single place and more an aura around the pole. It can be invoked as an ancient confirmation that the North holds wonders. It can also be left unnamed, its role played by anonymous landmasses whose only justification is that the page feels too empty without them. The ancient term Hyperborean had already been elastic. Cartography gave that elasticity a body. And then, slowly, the body begins to dissolve. As voyages pushed into higher latitudes, often at great cost, and as knowledge of coastlines improved, some of the speculative polar structures began to retreat from maps. Not all at once, not dramatically. The erasure is one of the most unsettling features. It is quiet. A later edition omits what an earlier edition confidently drew. A coastline is corrected. An island shrinks or vanishes. The pole becomes less ornate, more empty, more honest. The imagination loses territory. This quiet correction is not evidence of suppression, it is evidence of method. It is what happens when information is tested against ice and storm and measured distances. Still, for an investigator of myths, the quietness itself is a kind of clue. It shows how easily a confident image can live for decades on paper, shaping thought, before being revised. It also shows how fragile the Northern Archive is. The North is not only hard to reach, it is hard to stabilize in the mind. Yet, even as speculative polar continents faded, the cultural use of Hyperborea did not die. It migrated again, this time into philosophical and later romantic ideas of origins. The word could be used to suggest an ancient homeland, a northern source of purity, or a symbolic before. This migration is crucial because it changes what clues mean. In cartography, a clue might be a repeated shape. In philosophy, a clue might be a repeated metaphor. In both cases, the danger is the same. Repetition can be mistaken for confirmation. The investigation also has to acknowledge how the 19th and 20th centuries, with their expanding archaeological and linguistic studies, created new ways to talk about origins. Comparative mythology, historical linguistics, and later genetics opened genuine evidence based conversations about migration, language families, and the deep history of human populations. But these same fields also produced speculative fringes, where old names like Hyperborea were pulled into claims that went far beyond what evidence can support. Some writers use the term in ideological ways, attaching it to racial myths and nationalist fantasies. That history leaves a residue. It makes any modern discussion of Hyperborea ethically delicate and methodologically strict. The name carries both ancient poetry and modern misuse. So the investigation chooses a narrower path. It will treat Hyperborea as an old question about the North, about what the ancients believed, what they may have heard, what early modern mapmakers drew, and what later sciences can and cannot say about human origins in high latitudes. It will avoid turning the name into a banner. In the next movement, the lens shifts again, from maps to the physical traces that people sometimes point to as Hyperborean clues, megaliths in northern Europe, enigmatic carvings, ritual landscapes, and the way certain symbols recur across wide distances. The danger here is obvious. Similarities can be coincidence, convergence, or the result of contact at different times. But the fascination persists because the stones remain when texts fall silent. And when the archive grows quiet, the mind listens harder to whatever still stands in the cold. Stone outlasts paper. When the written record grows thin, stone becomes tempting, not because it speaks clearly, but because it refuses to disappear. Across northern Europe and into parts of the Atlantic fringe, there are monuments that predate classical authors by millennia. Megalithic tombs, standing stones, stone circles, passage graves. They are real, datable through archaeology, and widely studied. They are also vulnerable to projection. A stone can be made to say almost anything if the listener is impatient. Hyperborea, as an idea of a northern origin, sometimes attaches itself to these monuments. The logic is simple. If the north contains ancient structures, perhaps the north contains ancient beginnings. But simplicity is not truth. Archaeology shows that monumental building in Europe has deep roots, particularly in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, and that it emerged in different regional traditions with both local development and long distance contact. The challenge is to hold both facts at once. The monuments are real, and the interpretation is contested. Consider the great megalithic landscapes of Britain and Ireland, Stonehenge, Avebury, Newgrange, and many others. Their builders left no written explanation. What remains are alignments, artifacts, construction phases, and the landscapes themselves. Researchers have debated their purposes for generations: ritual, burial, calendrical markers, social gathering places, statements of power. The evidence supports multiple functions over time. This multiplicity is important. It warns against single story explanations, especially when those explanations reach for a mythic homeland. Farther north and east, Scandinavia holds its own monumental traditions: stone ship settings, burial mounds, rock carvings. In Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, petroglyphs and runestones belong to different periods, but they share a northern sensibility: ships, suns, animals, weapons, processions. Some rock art, such as the Bronze Age carvings in places like Tanum in Sweden, is well studied and often interpreted in relation to maritime culture, ritual, and cosmology. Here again, the temptation is to see a single symbolic code that points to an original, Hyperborean worldview. But the more careful approach is slower. It asks what can be inferred from the motifs and what cannot. Symbols recur across cultures for many reasons. The sun is a universal object. Spirals can emerge naturally from simple decorative impulses or from observations of motion and cycles. Boats appear where people rely on water. The fact of recurrence does not, by itself, prove a shared origin. Yet recurrence can still be meaningful when paired with context, chronology, trade networks, migration patterns, and the spread of technologies. This is where the investigation must lean on established academic debates rather than free association. Archaeology and related fields have built a picture of prehistoric Europe that is both connected and diverse. There were long distance exchanges of materials. Amber, for instance, moved across regions. So did metals in later periods. Maritime routes connected coasts. River systems connected interiors. Contact was real. The question is not whether contact happened, but how far it extended, when, and what it carried. Goods, people, stories, or simply the knowledge that other worlds existed. In some discussions of Hyperborea, the emphasis falls on the far north as a place of unusual sky phenomena. Aurora borealis, for example, can be seen at lower latitudes during strong geomagnetic storms, but it is more common and dramatic at higher latitudes. Could ancient peoples have encoded auroral experiences into symbols? Possibly. Some scholars have explored how atmospheric phenomena might influence myth, but such claims are difficult to prove. A spiral on rock might be a sun, a whirlpool, a snake, a journey, or an aesthetic flourish. Without supporting context, interpretation remains probabilistic, not decisive. The same caution applies to alignments. Many megalithic monuments show some relationship to solar or lunar events, and archaeoastronomy has produced real insights. But alignments can be overfitted. With enough stones and enough celestial events, coincidences become likely. The strongest cases come when alignments are consistent across monuments of a region, when construction features clearly emphasize particular sightlines, and when the archaeological context supports ritual attention to the sky. Even then, the meaning is inferred, not recorded. So, why do these stones feel like clues at all? Because they sit at the edge of literacy. They belong to times when human societies were changing rapidly: agriculture, settlement, social complexity. They are also geographically spread in ways that can suggest connections. And they often sit in northern latitudes where later classical writers place the idea of distant sanctuaries. The mind naturally tries to join these dots. The disciplined investigator resists joining them too quickly. There is another strand: the idea of a northern cradle for Indo European languages, sometimes discussed in academic contexts in relation to steppe hypotheses and migration debates. Here, too, Hyperborea sometimes gets pulled in as a poetic label. But the academic debate about Proto Indo European origins is based on linguistics, archaeology, and increasingly genetics, not on Greek myths of a blessed land. The steppe hypothesis, associated with migrations from the Pontic Caspian steppe in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, is widely supported by multiple lines of evidence, though details and alternative models continue to be debated. This debate is not Hyperborea, but it shows why the North, broadly defined, remains relevant to conversations about human origins in Eurasia. The danger is to collapse categories, to treat a Bronze Age migration model as confirmation of a mythic homeland, or to treat a Greek poetic toponym as an encoded ethnographic report. Neither move is justified, but it is possible to let the two sit near each other in the mind without forcing them into the same box. A myth can echo a direction of attention without mapping onto a specific archaeological culture. And then there are the sealed spaces themselves, passage graves like Newgrange, Maeshowe and Orkney, and other cairns and tombs that lead through narrow corridors into chambers where sound, light, and geometry can feel intentional. These places are real, excavated, and studied. Some are aligned with solstice, sunrise, or sunset, allowing light to penetrate deep into the chamber on specific days. Such designs suggest a ritual relationship with time and the sky. They also create a motif that fits the investigation's DNA: corridors, sealed doors, hidden chambers, and the way a society marks what is not for everyday eyes. In a calm voice, the investigation notes what is solid. These monuments show that Northern and Atlantic Europe held complex ceremonial traditions long before classical Greece. They show that people organized labor, engineered stone, and designed for celestial cycles. They show that civilization is not confined to later literate empires. That alone can feel like a rewrite of origins, at least for minds trained to equate history with texts. But Hyperborea is still a step removed. The monuments do not say Hyperborea. They do not point to a single polar homeland. They point to human capacity and regional traditions. The clue, if there is one, is subtler. The North was never empty, never mute, never merely a blank edge for Southern imagination. It had its own deep time, and deep time can create the illusion of a single source when it is really many sources layered. In the next movement, the investigation turns to another kind of clue that is often invoked in arguments about origins: shared mythic motifs across Indo European and Northern traditions, world mountains, sacred rivers, divine journeys, and the persistent fascination with a far northern axis. The question will not be whether these motifs prove Hyperborea, but whether they reveal a human tendency to place beginnings in the direction of the pole, where the sky itself seems to revolve around a fixed point. Myth moves the way weather moves, across borders, across languages, across centuries, leaving recognizable pressure patterns even when the storms that form them are long gone. If Hyperborea is approached through myth rather than geography, the investigation enters a different kind of archive: not stone and sediment, but recurring images that appear in distant places. This is where the inquiry can become both seductive and dangerous. Seductive, because patterns feel like proof. Dangerous, because patterns can be forced. The ancient Greek idea of a blessed land beyond the north wind is not alone in placing significance near the far north. Across many Eurasian traditions, there are images of a world axis, an axis mundi, often imagined as a mountain, a pillar, a tree, or a central point around which the sky turns. In some Indo Iranian traditions, there are sacred mountains and polar like imagery, though the details and interpretations are debated among scholars. In Norse tradition, later recorded in medieval Icelandic texts, the world tree Yggdrasil stands as a cosmic structure linking realms. These motifs are not identical, and they should not be treated as a single code. But the recurrence of central vertical imagery is widespread, suggesting a common human impulse to imagine the world as oriented around a center. The question is whether that center is specifically northern or whether north is being read into general cosmology. Many cultures observe the sky's apparent rotation around a point, and in the northern hemisphere, that point lies near the north celestial pole. Even without a bright pole star at all times, the circling of stars can suggest a pivot. It is not unreasonable to think that ancient observers, especially at higher latitudes where the circumpolar stars are more prominent, would build stories around that pivot. But it is also not necessary for the stories to originate in an Arctic homeland. The sky is visible everywhere. The pivot is a feature of the heavens for anyone north of the equator. Some modern writers have argued that certain symbols, such as swastika like forms, spirals, or rotating motifs, encode polar sky observations. There is an academic literature on symbol interpretation, and there is also an expansive speculative literature that goes beyond what evidence can bear. The investigation must keep its footing. A symbol can represent rotation, cycles, the sun, good fortune, or many other concepts depending on culture and context. The swastika, in particular, has deep ancient usage across multiple regions and periods, and its meanings vary. Any claim that it is primarily a polar map is an interpretive leap. Still, the possibility that rotating motifs sometimes relate to celestial observation remains plausible in specific contexts, especially when accompanied by other sky related imagery. Hyperborea's mythic role can also be compared to the idea of distant northern lands in later European imagination. Ultima Thule as a limit, a threshold place where known geography ends. The difference is that Hyperborea is often described not merely as distant, but as blessed, peaceful, close to gods, free of ordinary suffering. That moral coloring resembles other Golden Age myths, but its placement beyond the north wind gives it a peculiar geometry. It is as if the world has a hidden sanctuary behind its harshest barrier. Here, the investigation pauses on the psychological dimension. People often place perfection beyond difficulty. The distance itself becomes part of the purity. If a land cannot be reached easily, it cannot be easily contaminated by ordinary politics and disappointment. Hyperborea, in that sense, functions as a sealed space, an imagined chamber beyond access. It is not surprising that later ages would return to it when they needed a symbol of origins unsullied by history's mess. Yet there is another thread in the Greek material, the relationship between Hyperborea and Apollo, and the stories of offerings moving south. If those stories reflect anything beyond metaphor, they reflect a belief in connection. Not direct travel, perhaps, but a kind of spiritual trade route. The notion of a chain of intermediaries carries a haunting realism. Even if the Hyperboreans are imagined, the idea of goods traveling through many hands is not. The myth may be using a real mechanism to deliver a symbolic payload. The investigation also has to consider that myths can store faint impressions of real phenomena, even when wrapped in divine language. Seasonal extremes are one candidate. Another is the idea of a distant land of continuous celebration or continuous light. In Greek descriptions, Hyperborea is sometimes associated with ease and long life. Could such descriptions have been inspired by reports of summer days that do not end, creating the impression of continuous time? Possibly. But the leap from long daylight to long life is interpretive, and it could just as easily be a moral metaphor. Those who live near the gods live longer. A further complication comes from the diversity of Norths. For Greeks, North could mean Thrace, Macedonia, the Black Sea, Scythia, each a different world. For Romans, North included Gaul, Germany, Britain, and beyond. For later medieval writers, North included Scandinavia, Greenland, and the fringes of the known Atlantic. In such a shifting context, a mythic North can attach itself to different real places over time. Hyperborea might be less a memory of one region and more a movable marker of remoteness and sanctity. This mobility does not make the myth meaningless, it makes it diagnostic. It reveals how cultures orient themselves, where they place danger, where they place purity, where they place the unknown. The pole, as a concept, becomes especially potent because it is both fixed and unreachable. It is a point in the sky and a point on the globe. It invites geometry. It invites metaphor. It invites the idea that the world has a hidden hinge. At this stage, the investigation gathers a kind of cautious hypothesis, not about a lost civilization, but about the function of Hyperborea in the human mind. Hyperborea may be a name for the sensation that origins lie just beyond the boundary of experience. That sensation can be triggered by real northern phenomena: light cycles, auroras, ice, the turning stars, but it does not require a specific city or empire. It requires only the experience of a limit. Still, the title of this work speaks of clues across the earth that rewrite human origins. That phrase can be understood without abandoning restraint. Modern science has indeed rewritten human origins repeatedly. Through archaeology revealing deep prehistory, through genetics revealing migrations and interbreeding, through climate science revealing changing landscapes. These rewrites are not built on Hyperborea as fact, but they do create a context in which old myths of lost beginnings feel newly tempting. When the scientific record reveals that humans traveled farther and earlier than once assumed, the imagination returns to old names and wonders if they were shadows of real journeys. In the next movement, the investigation turns toward those modern rewrites, especially the evidence for Ice Age and early Holocene human presence in northern latitudes, the adaptation to cold environments, and the shifting habitability of regions near the Arctic Circle. The question will not be whether Hyperborea was real, but whether the deep human story of the North is richer than the classical archive ever admitted, and whether that richness helps explain why a name like Hyperborea would continue to haunt the edges of the record. The modern record of human origins has a habit of expanding into places once considered unlikely. Archaeology and paleoanthropology have pushed the story of human presence farther back in time and farther outward in geography, not by romance, but by bones, tools, sediments, and careful argument. In this expanding story, the North is no longer a blank margin. It is a difficult archive, one shaped by ice, permafrost, erosion, and sea level change, but it is not empty. For much of the 20th century, the deep history of northern latitudes was often imagined as late, humans arriving only after conditions softened. That picture has been revised in important ways. Evidence of Upper Paleolithic and later human presence in high latitudes is now well established in parts of Eurasia. Sites in Siberia, for example, have shown that humans adapted to cold environments tens of thousands of years ago. The details vary by region and by the strength of evidence at particular sites, but the broad conclusion is not controversial. Humans were capable of living in severe climates earlier than many older models assumed. This does not create Hyperborea, it creates context. It shows that the idea of a far northern human world is not inherently absurd. It is entirely possible for people to have lived, traveled, hunted, and formed cultures near the Arctic Circle long before classical Greece. The difficulty is that the material record there is uneven. Ice and water erase. Permafrost preserves in some places and destroys in others. Sea level rise after the last glacial maximum submerged coastal plains that could have been rich in human activity. The North, in that sense, contains sealed corridors and missing rooms, but these are geological, not institutional. When researchers speak of Beringia, They refer to the broad region that connected parts of Siberia and Alaska during periods of lower sea level. This landmass and its surrounding environments played a major role in human migration into the Americas. The timing and pathways of that migration remain actively studied, with debates over coastal routes, inland ice free corridors, and the chronology of early sites. The important point for this investigation is not the details of the American peopling debate, but the implication. There was a northern world of human movement and adaptation that existed outside the classical Mediterranean imagination. The title's promise, Clues Across the Earth, begins to feel less like a poetic flourish and more like an honest description of how modern knowledge works. Genetics, archaeology, and climate science stitch clues across continents. They reveal that populations moved, mixed, and sometimes vanished. They reveal lineages that left traces in DNA but not in the written record. They reveal that origins are often braided rather than singular. In this braided picture, the North becomes a place where the record can grow unexpectedly strange. One reason is preservation. In some Siberian contexts, frozen ground has preserved remains and artifacts with a clarity rare elsewhere. This can produce sudden bursts of evidence that seem to open a sealed chamber of time, yet preservation also creates its own illusions. A well preserved site can dominate interpretation, while equally important but less preserved regions remain silent. The archive is uneven not because history was uneven, but because preservation is. Another reason the North can feel strange is that it disrupts older assumptions about what civilization requires. People do not need agriculture to build complex social worlds. They do not need cities to create art, ritual, and long distance exchange. The Upper Paleolithic record includes sophisticated symbolic behavior in many regions, and northern adaptations show ingenuity in tools, clothing, shelter, and hunting strategies. None of this proves a lost polar civilization. It proves that human capability is older and more geographically flexible than earlier linear narratives suggested. This flexibility, however, can be misused. Some fringe claims jump from humans lived in cold regions to there was an advanced Arctic civilization whose traces were erased. The investigation refuses that leap. A cold adapted hunter gatherer society can be extraordinary without being an empire. Complexity does not require the trappings that later states developed. The absence of evidence for cities near the pole in deep prehistory is not a scandal. It is consistent with what is known about environments and lifeways. Still, the mind lingers on the way myths can arise around places where the record is thin. When evidence is scarce, imagination expands. The far north, with its long darkness and strange lights, encourages story. If southern peoples heard of these phenomena, through intermediaries, through travelers, through the movement of amber and furs and tails, it would not be surprising for them to frame the North as both dangerous and sacred. Hyperborea could be one expression of that framing. There is also the question of how far south knowledge of northern phenomena traveled. Amber, for example, reached the Mediterranean in antiquity, valued and traded across long distances. The movement of amber implies networks and intermediaries. Where goods travel, stories travel. A trader might describe the sun's long linger near the horizon, the strange brightness of summer nights, the auroral curtains. Such descriptions could be exaggerated, but they could also be accurate enough to impress and unsettle listeners. The Mediterranean archive would receive these impressions without receiving the full context. This is where the motif of maps that change becomes less literal and more conceptual. The map of human history has changed dramatically in the last century. New sites are discovered, old assumptions collapse, migration models are revised. A place once considered marginal becomes central to understanding a movement of peoples. A corridor once thought empty is revealed to have been traveled. The human story is full of such revisions. Hyperborea can be read, in this modern light, not as a literal lost kingdom, but as an ancient intuition that the North matters to origins in ways the classical center could not fully explain. That intuition might be wrong in specifics and still right in direction. It might have been poetry reaching toward a truth it could not articulate, that human time extends far beyond written archives, and that the edges of the known world are often the places where the deepest past is least accessible. The investigation also notes a modern phenomenon. As science reveals more about climate cycles, glacial periods, abrupt warming events, shifts in ocean circulation, public imagination becomes fascinated with catastrophes and resets. Some people reach for myths of flood and lost lands to explain discontinuities. Here again, Hyperborea gets pulled into narratives of cyclical destruction. Yet the scientific discussion of abrupt climate events, such as those near the end of the last ice age, is complex and regionally variable. It is a field of evidence and debate, not a single dramatic tale. Any attempt to attach Hyperborea to a specific catastrophe must therefore remain tentative and clearly marked as speculation. In the next movement, the inquiry approaches that edge carefully, the intersection of northern myths with evidence for climatic upheavals and landscape change. Not to proclaim a hidden past, but to ask why so many cultures preserve stories of lost worlds and why the North, of all directions, keeps appearing as both refuge and threat. The corridor ahead is narrow, the air grows colder. The record, once again, begins to thin. Climate does not write myths, but it can carve the conditions in which myths thrive. When landscapes change faster than memory can comfortably hold, stories become vessels for loss. The end of the last ice age was not a single moment, but a long transition punctuated by shifts that, in some regions, may have felt abrupt on a human scale. Ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, rivers changed their courses, plains became seabeds, forest advanced, tundra withdrew. For people living through these transformations, the world's edges were not stable. The scientific record describes these changes through proxies, ice cores, pollen, sediment layers, and the distribution of species. It measures and models. It debates the timing and magnitude of events. In popular imagination, these shifts often compress into a single catastrophe, an instant flood, an annihilating freeze, a sudden reset. The investigation resists that compression, but it also acknowledges something quieter. Even gradual change can feel like erasure when it removes familiar landmarks. A coastline that retreats each generation still creates a sense of a world being taken. If Hyperborea is to be considered in the shadow of climate history, it must be done with discipline. The name itself is Greek, and Greek writers were not recording Pleistocene sea level curves. Yet the idea of a far northern land with unusual light could intersect, indirectly, with how the post glacial north transformed. As ice retreated, new lands opened for habitation. As forests grew, hunting patterns shifted. As seas rose, coastal routes changed. The North was a moving frontier. A moving frontier tends to generate rumors. There is land beyond. There is open water. There are islands. The sea is thick. The sun does not set. Some rumors are true. Others distort. In the Mediterranean archive, they can settle into the shape of myth. There is also a broader mythic pattern. Many cultures have stories of lost lands, floods, and former ages. These stories are not all the same and should not be merged into a single global narrative. Flood myths can arise from local river floods, storm surges, or moral storytelling. Yet the widespread presence of world change stories suggests that humans, as a species, are attentive to environmental disruption. They encode it in symbols and rituals. They remember in narrative form that stability is fragile. The North, in particular, can symbolize this fragility because its boundaries are visibly unstable. The ice edge advances and retreats. The sea's skin changes. The sky behaves differently. A place where the sun disappears for weeks is a place where the world ends can feel literal. If a southern listener hears such descriptions, the North becomes a theater for the imagination's most extreme possibilities, paradise beyond winter, or annihilation beyond the wind. Modern discussions sometimes tie the idea of a polar, lost world to hypothesized changes in the Arctic itself, shifts in ice cover, changes in ocean circulation, and, in some speculative literature, the notion of an ice-free Arctic in certain past periods. In the early Holocene, there were indeed warmer intervals in parts of the northern hemisphere, though the Arctic's history is complex and regionally varied. It is plausible that some areas experienced conditions that allowed richer ecosystems than later periods did. But plausible is not the same as proven, and none of this requires a mythic Hyperborean sanctuary. Still, the investigation notices the way certain early modern maps, already discussed, suggested open polar seas and navigable channels. Those suggestions were not purely mythic, they were tied to real questions of exploration and commerce. They also reflect a period when knowledge of sea ice dynamics was limited. If a sailor encountered open water at a particular season or latitude, the experience could be generalized into a theory of a permanently open sea near the pole. The idea was wrong in its permanence, but it was not irrational in its origin. It was a human attempt to make sense of partial observation. This is how the motif of maps that change becomes almost tender. A map is a memory of what someone thought the world looked like, drawn under constraints of time, danger, and incomplete information. When later maps erase earlier polar fantasies, they are not only correcting errors, they are closing a corridor of possibility. They are sealing an imagined passage. Hyperborea, as a name, can thrive in that sealed corridor. If the physical passage cannot be found, the mythic one becomes more alluring. And in modern times, as climate science reveals how dramatically the planet has changed, the appetite for lost lands grows. The more the ground beneath history shifts, the more people search for a stable before. The investigation turns, briefly, to the scientific concept of refugia, places where species, including humans, could survive during harsh climatic phases. In glacial times, refugia existed in lower latitudes and sheltered microclimates. After glaciers retreated, populations expanded. Refugia are real, studied, and crucial to understanding biodiversity and human movement. A mythic Hyperborea could be imagined as a refugium, but this is an imaginative analogy, not a claim. The actual refugia for humans during glacial maxima were shaped by resource availability and habitability. The far Arctic was, at times, harsh. Yet humans did inhabit high latitude regions in Eurasia in certain periods, showing that habitability is not a simple line. Another modern thread sometimes invoked is the existence of submerged prehistoric landscapes beneath the North Sea and other shallow seas, Doggerland being the most famous example. Doggerland, the now submerged land that once connected Britain to mainland Europe during lower sea levels, has become a powerful symbol of lost worlds. Archaeological evidence, including finds dredged from the sea and research mapping submerged terrain, supports the reality of such landscapes. Doggerland is not Hyperborea, but it demonstrates the principle that human landscapes can be erased by rising seas, leaving gaps in the record that feel like missing chapters. The emotional effect of such erasure is important. It explains why people reach for myth. When the record is incomplete, the mind fills the absence. Sometimes it fills it responsibly, with hypotheses that can be tested. Sometimes it fills it with narratives that cannot. Hyperborea sits at this crossroads, an ancient name that can be read as a poetic placeholder for beyond, and a modern magnet for the desire to find an origin that the ocean or ice might have hidden. The investigation remains quiet and careful. It does not claim that Hyperborea refers to Doggerland or to any specific submerged region. It does not claim that a polar landmass once existed as drawn on speculative maps. It does not claim that Greek myths encode Ice Age history. Instead, it frames a narrower point. The North is one of the places where environmental change has been most visible and most disruptive across long time scales, and this visibility can nourish myths of lost lands and blessed refuges. In the next movement, the inquiry shifts from climate and landscape to the bloodstream of modern origin stories, language, and genetics. Not as a hunt for a single Hyperborean people, but as an examination of how evidence of migration and mixture can create the sensation of a hidden source, an ancestral corridor that connects distant populations in ways that older histories never recorded. The archive is about to change its medium again, from stone and ice to letters and genes. There's a peculiar kind of silence in language. Words carry ancestry, but they do not carry dates. They preserve patterns long after the people who first spoke them have turned to dust, yet they rarely preserve a clear map of where those people lived. Historical linguistics learn to listen to this silence with discipline. It compares sound changes, reconstructs probable ancestors, and proposes family trees and branching patterns. The method is rigorous, but it is also probabilistic. It can suggest origins and pathways. It rarely delivers a single, undisputed birthplace. When modern readers hear rewrite human origins, they often think first of genetics. But before genetics, linguistics already performed a kind of rewrite. It proposed that many languages of Europe and parts of Asia belong to one family, Indo European, and that their similarities were not coincidence. This idea reshaped the understanding of deep history. It suggested that migrations and contacts occurred long before written chronicles. It implied that the map of the past was larger than the map of surviving texts. Hyperborea sometimes enters popular conversation at this point as a poetic stand in for an ancestral homeland. The investigation must draw a boundary here. Indo European origins are a serious academic field with competing hypotheses. Hyperborea is a classical myth. The two can be compared in the sense that both deal with North and origins, but they do not confirm each other. Within Indo European studies, one influential model is often called the steppe hypothesis, linking the dispersal of Indo European languages to pastoralist societies of the Pontic Caspian steppe and related regions during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Archaeological cultures, such as those associated with the Yamnaya Horizon, are frequently discussed in this context, along with technological and social changes like horse domestication and wheeled vehicles. The evidence supporting aspects of this model comes from multiple fields, but debates continue about timing, routes, and the relationship between language spread and population movement. Alternative models, such as various forms of Anatolian hypotheses, have also been argued, though the current balance of evidence is often presented as favoring steppe-related expansions for many branches. The details are nuanced and not settled in every respect. If the steppe hypothesis holds broadly, then north in this context is not the Arctic Pole, but the open grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, a world of vast horizons and mobile lifeways. It is a north that classical Greeks knew indirectly through Scythians and other steppe peoples. It is also a north that could have fed Mediterranean myths as a distant zone of strange customs and seasonal extremes. But it is not beyond Boreas in a literal polar sense. It is a mid-latitude north, more accessible, more human, and more documented archaeologically than the far Arctic. The investigation notes, quietly, that this steppe north has its own mythic resonance. It is a corridor between Europe and Asia. It is a place where large-scale movements could happen without leaving cities behind. It is a place where languages could spread like grass fire. For a culture centered on the sea and the polis, such a world might have felt both fascinating and unsettling. An open space without walls, a society defined by motion. If Hyperborea is an imagined sanctuary beyond the north wind, the steppe is a real corridor within the north wind's reach. Genetics has added another layer to this picture, and with it, another kind of silence. DNA carries ancestry without carrying names. It can reveal admixture events, population splits, and migrations in broad strokes. It can show that people who lived far apart shared deep connections, but it cannot tell the stories those people told about themselves. It cannot tell whether a language moved with them or over them. It cannot tell whether myths traveled alongside genes or independently. Genetics, like linguistics, is a powerful tool that must be interpreted with caution. Over the past decade and more, ancient DNA studies have transformed understanding of prehistoric Eurasia. They have provided evidence for population movements and mixtures that align, in some respects, with archaeological and linguistic models. They have also revealed complexity, multiple waves, regional variation, and interactions that do not fit simple narratives. In this complexity, the temptation returns to imagine a single hidden source, a first people whose imprint is everywhere. But the evidence usually points away from singularity and toward layering. Some genetic discussions include the idea of ghost populations, ancestral groups inferred from genetic patterns but not yet identified with a specific archaeological culture or region. The term itself can be misleading if treated as mystical. It is a technical way of acknowledging that the current sampling of ancient remains is incomplete. There are gaps in geography and time. When the data suggests ancestry from an unsampled population, researchers model it as a missing component. Over time, as more remains are sampled, some ghosts become less ghostly, others remain uncertain. This scientific humility echoes the investigation's motif: missing records, sealed spaces, corridors not yet opened. The difference is that in genetics, the corridor may someday be opened by a new dataset, a new excavation, a new technique. In myth, the corridor remains symbolic. Hyperborea's allure in this context is easy to understand. When genetics reveals deep connections across Eurasia, and when linguistics reconstructs ancestral roots, the imagination wants a place name for the source. Hyperborea offers a ready-made northward label, but it is a label built from poetry, not from data. To attach it directly to genetic findings would be to commit the very error this investigation tries to avoid, turning metaphor into measurement. Still, the investigation can responsibly trace parallels. One parallel is the repeated role of northern and steppe regions as corridors of movement. Another is the way modern methods repeatedly discover that the past was more mobile than older histories assumed. This mobility can make old myths feel less implausible in their broad sense. That distant regions mattered, that people and ideas moved farther than the classical archive admitted. There's also a subtler parallel in the way both myth and science handle uncertainty. Myth often resolves uncertainty with sacred narrative. Science resolves it with probability distributions and cautious inference. Both are responses to the same human discomfort, the discomfort of not knowing where one comes from. In the next movement, the investigation turns toward the edges of the Indo-European and Northern story, where myth, archaeology, and later written traditions begin to overlap more directly. The late prehistoric and early historic north of Europe, Germanic, Celtic, Baltic, and Finnic worlds, and the way classical writers describe them from afar. Here the record becomes a patchwork: Roman ethnography, later medieval texts, material culture, and linguistic reconstruction. It is a place where names shift, where identities blur, and where the North once again appears as both a real region and a symbolic beyond, an ancestral corridor half lit, half sealed. As the classical world pressed against Northern Europe, it did not find Hyperborea waiting like a signpost. It found peoples with names that shifted depending on who was speaking: Celts, Germans, Scythians, Sarmatians, and many others. It found coastlines that resisted easy description. It found forests, marshes, and seas that behaved differently from the Mediterranean. And it found a reality that was, in many ways, more ordinary than myth and yet still unsettling to an empire that measured itself by cities and roads. Roman ethnography is one of the principal lenses through which the classical archive viewed the northern world. Writers like Julius Caesar, in his accounts of Gaul, and Tacitus, in his Germania, described northern peoples with a mixture of observation, political purpose, and moral framing. These texts are valuable and problematic at once. They contain real information about interactions, warfare, customs, and geography. They also contain rhetorical strategies: the noble savage mirror, the use of foreignness to critique Rome, the exaggeration of threat to justify conquest. To read them as pure fact is naive. To dismiss them as pure invention is also naive. They are part of the corridor where history becomes literature. In these Roman and late classical descriptions, the far north remains at the edge. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, beyond the forests and Baltic shores, the archive grows uncertain again. Names blur. Some writers speak of Thule, others speak of islands and seas that freeze. The idea of an ocean thickened by cold appears, sometimes echoing older northern travel narratives. Yet, Hyperborea as a specific term appears less as a practical geography and more as a literary inheritance, an old word that can still be invoked, but not one that guides legions. This shift is itself revealing. Hyperborea seems most vivid when geography is least known. As the North becomes more known, At least in parts, it becomes harder for the mythic label to hold. The beyond is forced to move farther away. The corridor retracts. Yet the North, even when more known, continues to carry motifs that resemble the older Hyperborean aura: extreme climate, seasonal light, and a sense of a world oriented differently. Roman writers noted the long nights and strange daylight of northern summers, though their reports vary and are sometimes confused. The very effort to describe such phenomena suggests they mattered. They were not decorative, they were disorienting. They challenged the Mediterranean sense of how time behaves. Meanwhile, in the North itself, written records were still sparse for long stretches of time. Many societies transmitted history orally. When writing appears more widely in Northern Europe, it does so unevenly. Runic inscriptions in Germanic contexts, later manuscripts in Christianized settings, and the recording of older myths and sagas centuries after the events they claim to describe. This creates a layered archive where the earliest written Northern voices are often brief, formulaic, and hard to interpret, while the richer narratives are later, shaped by new religious and political frameworks. The investigator moves through this archive with caution. A medieval Icelandic saga can preserve older traditions, but it can also reshape them in literary form. A Roman ethnography can preserve real observations, but it can also distort for rhetorical effect. Between these sources lies a long corridor of silence where archaeological evidence carries much of the story. In that archaeological story, Northern Europe shows increasing complexity over the Bronze and Iron Ages. Trade networks, metallurgy, social stratification, shifting settlement patterns. The Baltic becomes a zone of exchange. The North Sea becomes a highway. Roman goods travel north. Northern amber travels south. The corridor between worlds is active. It is tempting, at this point, to imagine that Hyperborea's offerings myth, the chain of sacred gifts traveling south, might be a poetic echo of such trade routes. This is possible as a loose analogy. It is not provable as a direct connection. The myth predates much of the Roman era exchange we can document, and trade routes shift over time. But the existence of long distance movement makes the idea of a chain less absurd. It places a plausible mechanism under a symbolic tale. And yet, the farther north one goes, the more the record returns to its old posture: uncertain, secondhand, filled with gaps. The Arctic fringe of Europe and Russia was not thoroughly mapped or written about in classical times. The Sami and other northern peoples appear only intermittently in southern sources, often through distorted lenses. Their own oral traditions have their own depth and complexity, but much of that record entered written form much later and under colonial pressures. Any attempt to read these traditions as direct evidence for Hyperborea would be irresponsible. Still, they remind the investigation of something essential. The North had its own histories that were not waiting to be discovered by Southern pens. They were lived. Hyperborea, in this movement, becomes less a literal place and more a symptom of asymmetry. The asymmetry between the center that writes and the periphery that is written about. When the center speaks of the far north, it often turns the periphery into a canvas for moral and cosmic ideas. The periphery becomes beyond, rather than a set of communities with names and complexities. This asymmetry is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of historical survival. Writing preserves some voices and not others. Climate preserves some materials and not others. Political power preserves some archives and burns others. The gaps are not always deliberate. Sometimes they are simply the natural result of what is fragile. The investigation feels the weight of that fragility here. If Hyperborea is a myth about a place beyond wind, it may also be a myth about a place beyond the reach of the archive. The story exists because the details do not. The details do not because the corridor to those details, literal and cultural, was narrow, dangerous, and often closed. In the next movement, the inquiry returns to a different kind of corridor. The symbolic north in later esoteric and philosophical traditions, where Hyperborea is revived and repurposed. This is where the name becomes most distorted, sometimes pulled into ideological fantasies. The investigation will not amplify those fantasies, but it cannot ignore the historical fact that the name was used. It must ask why certain eras, especially those anxious about origins, reach for a far northern myth and try to turn it into a foundation. The corridor ahead is lined with mirrors again, and some of them are warped. There's a moment in the life of many old names when they stop being descriptive and start being recruited. Hyperborea, after centuries of drifting through classical texts and map margins, enters a period where it is less a question and more a claim. This shift does not happen all at once, and it does not happen in a single place. It happens through a gradual accumulation of reinterpretations, some scholarly, some romantic, some ideological, some explicitly esoteric. The name becomes a vessel into which later anxieties about origins are poured. The investigation approaches this territory carefully because it is the area where modern misuse is most visible. Some 19th and 20th century writers in different European contexts invoked Hyperborea to suggest a primordial northern homeland for an imagined pure people. In extreme cases, the term was entangled with racial ideology. These appropriations are historically real, but they are not evidence about prehistory. They are evidence about modern politics and the human tendency to weaponize myth. To acknowledge this is not to accuse all later interest in Hyperborea of bad faith. The 19th century also saw genuine scholarly developments: comparative philology, archaeology, systematic study of ancient texts. Romanticism, with its fascination for origins and lost worlds, influenced both art and scholarship. It is possible for a name like Hyperborea to be treated as a poetic symbol of northern antiquity without sliding into ideology. But the slope exists, and history shows it has been traveled. The key is to distinguish uses. In some contexts, Hyperborean remains a literary adjective, meaning simply northern in a heightened classical way. In other contexts, it becomes an assertion of an ancestral homeland, often attached to speculative reconstructions of ancient religion or to claims about primordial wisdom. In still other contexts, it becomes a banner for modern identity projects that select evidence and ignore complexity. The investigation does not linger on the loudest distortions. Instead, it observes the mechanism that allowed them. The mechanism is the same one seen in speculative polar maps, an absence that invites filling. The farther back one goes, the less written evidence exists. The less evidence exists, the more space there is for imaginative systems. Hyperborea offers a ready-made before, beyond the reach of ordinary verification. It is an empty room that can be furnished with whatever a writer wants the past to contain. Esoteric traditions, in particular, often thrive on such rooms. They prefer origins that are not accessible to ordinary methods. They favor lost continents, hidden masters, secret doctrines. In some of this literature, Hyperborea appears alongside other mythical places, sometimes treated as stages in a grand spiritual history. The investigation notes this as a cultural phenomenon, not as a historical claim. These systems often blend fragments of genuine scholarship with speculative leaps, creating a narrative that feels coherent because it is emotionally coherent, not because it is evidentially grounded. There's also a quieter scholarly problem that can unintentionally feed such narratives: the legitimate difficulty of tracing ancient religious ideas across time. When scholars compare myths and rituals across Indo-European traditions, they sometimes reconstruct patterns that likely existed in deep prehistory. This reconstruction is careful and method-based, but it can be misunderstood by the public as a license to imagine a single original, cult center, or homeland of wisdom. The public desire for a single origin can hijack nuanced scholarship. Hyperborea, then, becomes a test case for how a name travels through layers of interpretation. At the bottom is the classical material: scattered references, myths, ambiguous geography. Above that is early modern cartography, speculative shapes, lost sources, the persuasive authority of lines. Above that is modern scholarship, linguistics, archaeology, climate science, genetics, rewriting origins with evidence and debate. And woven through the upper layers are romantic and ideological uses that attempt to stabilize uncertainty into a single story. The investigation's tone remains restrained. It does not declare that Hyperborea was invented in a simple sense, because invention is not always a single act. It is often a process of accumulation. One poet's metaphor becomes another geographer's footnote, becomes a cartographer's line, becomes a romantic's homeland. At each step, the name gains a new function. The name becomes heavier. It begins to drag the past into shapes that serve the present. At this point, the inquiry returns to method. If the goal is to examine clues, then each kind of clue must be weighed differently. A classical reference is not the same as a prehistoric monument. A map is not the same as a genetic data set. A later esoteric claim is not the same as an archaeological excavation. The discipline is to keep these categories separate even when they rhyme. And yet, the investigation also recognizes that human beings rarely keep categories separate in their emotional lives. People want the past to mean something. They want an origin story that feels like a home. When the archive is fragmented, myth offers a home. When science complicates identity, myth can simplify it. Hyperborea is one of the names that has been used in that simplification. The ethical task is to resist turning the name into an answer. Still, the corridor does not end here. If the investigation stops at misuse, it misses the deeper question: why the North is so persistently attractive as a symbolic origin. Even when ideology is stripped away, the pole remains a powerful metaphor. The sky turns around it. The compass points toward it. The aurora curtains it. The winter seals it. The summer reveals it. The North is both fixed and unreachable, an ideal location for a myth of beginnings. In the next movement, the inquiry returns to the pole as symbol, but through a more grounded lens: navigation, astronomy, and the human relationship with orientation. How did ancient and medieval peoples understand direction? How did the pole star and the turning sky shape cosmology and travel? And how might a long standing fascination with the pivot of the heavens have fed the enduring sense that origins lie up there, beyond the wind, beyond the ordinary world? Direction is one of the oldest forms of knowledge. Long before written chronicles, people oriented themselves by rivers, mountains, prevailing winds, and the sky. In the northern hemisphere, the night sky offers a quiet instrument. The stars appear to wheel around a point. This apparent pivot is not equally obvious at every latitude, but it is present wherever the pole lies above the horizon. Over generations, that pivot can become more than a navigational aid. It can become a metaphysical suggestion. The world turns around something. The classical Greek imagination knew this pivot. Astronomers described the celestial sphere. Philosophers argued about the cosmos. Mariners watched the sky for guidance. The pole star, in different epochs, shifted slightly due to precession, and its brightness and position relative to the pole varied. Yet the idea of a northern anchor in the heavens was available. It is not difficult to see how such an anchor could feed a symbolic north, an axis, a center, a place of stability. Hyperborea, as beyond Boreas, is not explicitly at the pole. Yet later interpretations often drift toward the polar idea because the pole offers something the myth seems to crave: a fixed point beyond ordinary experience. If a place is imagined as blessed, distant, and aligned with divine cycles, the pole becomes an irresistible candidate. It is the point where the sun's behavior becomes most extreme. It is the point around which the sky's rotation is most dramatic. It is the point that is both real and difficult to reach. Navigation in the ancient and medieval worlds did not require polar fantasies, but it did produce them. Seafarers and travelers carried accounts of strange skies and strange seas. When such accounts were retold in centers of learning, they were interpreted through existing cosmologies. The result could be a layering of observation and theory. A sailor's report of long twilight becomes a philosopher's speculation about zones of the earth. A traveler's tale of ice becomes a cartographer's depiction of a boundary. Over time, the boundary might harden into a belief. Beyond a certain point lies either a navigable open sea or an impassable frozen wall. The investigation notes that ancient geography often divided the world into climatic zones. Some zones were considered too hot to inhabit, others too cold. These theories varied and were debated. They were attempts to rationalize the distribution of peoples and the limits of travel. In such a framework, a blessed land beyond cold would be paradoxical, almost a philosophical challenge. Hyperborea could serve as that challenge, a mythical exception that suggests the world is not fully captured by theory. Medieval and early modern thinkers inherited these zonal ideas along with classical texts. As exploration challenged inherited geography, the tension between theory and observation grew. A polar landmass drawn on a map could be a way to reconcile conflicting data, reports of islands, theories of symmetry, and the desire for a coherent globe. A central polar feature, whether imagined as a rock, a mountain, or a magnetic center, could also serve an explanatory role, especially as magnetism became a subject of curiosity. Here, the investigation must be cautious. The relationship between magnetism and the North has a complex history, and early ideas about magnetic poles were not the same as modern understanding. Some early writers speculated about magnetic mountains or rocks. These ideas sometimes appear in map lore and travel narratives. Yet speculation is not evidence of a physical polar mountain. It is evidence of how people tried to explain compass behavior and directional consistency with the tools they had. What matters for Hyperborea is not whether a magnetic mountain existed, but that the North became associated with hidden forces, forces that pull, orient, and compel. A compass needle pointing north can feel like a message from the world itself. In such a psychological landscape, the North is not just cold, it is meaningful. It is the direction the world insists upon. This insistence can contribute to the mythic sense of a northern origin. If the compass points north, if the sky rotates around north, if the aurora curtains the north, then north becomes a symbolic center, even if geography places civilization elsewhere. The mind begins to suspect that beginnings lie where orientation points, where the world's motions are most legible. But symbolism is not ancestry. The investigation repeats this internally, like a hand on a railing in the dark. A symbolic axis does not prove a literal homeland, yet symbolism can explain persistence. It can explain why Hyperborea, as a concept, survived shifts in knowledge. Even when the physical north was mapped more accurately, the symbolic north retained its power. The pole cannot be domesticated by cartography. It remains a singularity of orientation. This is also where the motif of restricted corridors returns, in a new form. The pole is a corridor of approach that is rarely straightforward. Ice blocks, weather threatens, latitude amplifies risk. For most of history, the far north was practically restricted, not by policy, but by environment. Access limitations were natural. That natural restriction feeds myth. A place that cannot easily be reached becomes a place that can be imagined. The inquiry now prepares to return to the title's promise: clues across the earth. One of the quietest clues is that many cultures, not only Greek, have placed special significance on the north, the pole, or a world axis. This does not prove a single origin. It suggests a shared human response to the sky's geometry. It suggests that rewriting origins might, in some cases, mean rewriting the assumption that origin stories are purely local. The sky itself is a shared text. Different cultures read it differently, but the letters, the turning stars, are the same. In the next movement, the investigation brings the strands together without tying them into a knot. The classical myth, the changing maps, the prehistoric monuments, the climate driven erasures, the linguistic migrations, the genetic mixtures, and the symbolic pole. The task will be to sit with the gap itself, to understand how the gap persists and why it matters, without forcing a final answer. The corridor ahead feels narrower, not because the world is closing, but because the mind is learning to walk without grabbing at certainty. The strands gathered so far do not braid into a single rope. They lie side by side like artifacts on a table that were found in different rooms. An ancient name, a chain of offerings, a pattern of speculative polar maps, stones aligned to light, evidence of northern adaptation, migrations traced in words and genes, and the persistent human habit of treating the pole as a hinge of meaning. None of these strands alone proves Hyperborea as a place. Together, they do something subtler. They make the gap feel deliberate, even if it is not. A gap can feel deliberate when it is stable across centuries. Hyperborea is stable in the sense that it remains beyond, and that beyondness is never conclusively resolved. The record keeps touching the edge and withdrawing. Ancient writers hint and doubt. Map makers draw and later erase. Archaeology reveals deep northern time, but not the neat kind of story a myth invites. Linguistics and genetics rewrite origins in ways that expand the map of the past, yet they do not give a single homeland with a classical name. The result is a landscape where certainty is always partial. This partiality invites two opposite reactions. One reaction is to dismiss the whole subject as mere fantasy and move on. The other is to fill the partiality with a grand narrative. The investigation chooses neither. It treats partiality as a feature of reality. The past is not obligated to be neat. The archive is not obligated to answer the questions modern minds want to ask. Still, there is a reason the mind keeps returning to Hyperborea. It is not only because the name is beautiful, it is because Hyperborea sits at a pressure point between different kinds of knowledge. Myth speaks of sacred origins. Geography speaks of physical limits. Science speaks of deep time and migration. The North, in particular, is where these domains rub against each other and generate heat. The ancient Greek material is a case study in how distant places become moralized. Hyperborea is not merely far, it is far and better. That moral charge is significant. It shows that distance can function as purification. It also shows that the Greeks, like many cultures, imagine the world as containing zones of different quality, some cursed, some blessed. This is not unique to Greece, but the placement of blessing beyond cold is a distinctive inversion that makes the myth memorable. When early modern maps draw ornate polar structures, the moral charge shifts into geometry. A map does not say blessed, but it can suggest order. The division of lands into symmetrical shapes, the presence of central features, the implication of channels. These all imply a kind of intelligibility. They imply that even the most remote region conforms to a plan. When later maps erase these features, they remove not only a hypothesis but a comfort. The comfort that the unknown can be drawn. Prehistoric monuments in northern and Atlantic Europe introduce a different kind of comfort and discomfort. They show that ancient peoples built with intention, oriented to cycles, and created sealed chambers that still hold light in precise ways. This is not a northern utopia. It is a northern depth. It complicates any narrative that treats the North as peripheral to human creativity. But it also resists being turned into a single origin story because the monuments are varied, regional, and layered over time. Climate history introduces the theme of erasure that is both literal and metaphorical. Coastlines disappear, landscapes sink, ice scours, permafrost preserves and then melts. In such a world, it is not surprising that human memory develops myths of lost lands. It is also not surprising that the North, where change is extreme and visible, becomes a stage for those myths. Linguistics and genetics introduce perhaps the most unsettling comfort, the idea that people are connected in ways older histories did not record. Populations mix, languages spread, ancestries overlap. The origin becomes less like a single birthplace and more like a braided stream. This can feel like a rewrite because it undermines simpler genealogies. Yet, it also offers a deeper continuity. The human story is not a set of isolated chambers, it is a network of corridors. In this network, the North is often a corridor rather than a destination. Steppe regions, river routes, maritime coasts, these were pathways of movement. Hyperborea, by contrast, often functions as a destination, a sacred beyond. The tension between corridor and destination is part of the myth's fascination. The scientific record emphasizes corridors. The myth emphasizes a sealed sanctuary. The mind wants both, the motion and the home. The investigation also confronts the historical fact that the name Hyperborea has been used in modern ideological ways. This is not a reason to abandon the inquiry, it is a reason to refine it. The misuse shows how easily the desire for origin can become a desire for purity. The disciplined approach is to keep origin complex, mixed, and unresolved where evidence demands it. So, what, then, is the responsible core of this investigation? It is the recognition that human origins, as a subject, always exist partly in the realm of inference. Even with modern science, the deep past contains unsampled regions, unexcavated sites, vanished coastlines, and traditions that were never written down. The gap is real. Hyperborea is one cultural expression of that gap. It is a name that signals the presence of an unanswered question at the edge of the known world. And yet, the investigation does not want to reduce Hyperborea to a mere symbol of ignorance. It wants to honor why people kept speaking it. A myth that persists often does so because it resonates with experience. The experience here may not be a hidden land, but rather the experience of looking north and feeling the world behave differently. Light that refuses to die in summer, darkness that refuses to lift in winter, the turning sky, the pull of the compass, the strange curtains of aurora, the sense of a boundary where ordinary rules thin. If that experience entered Mediterranean consciousness through trade and travel stories, it could have been transformed into the idea of a blessed beyond. If that idea then traveled into maps and philosophies, it could have gained new bodies. If modern science then revealed deep northern human time, the name could have felt newly charged, even if it did not correspond to a literal place. The next movement brings the inquiry closer to its end, not by answering, but by narrowing the focus to the emotional core of the gap, the human need to locate beginnings, and the way beginnings recede when approached. Hyperborea, in this sense, behaves like a horizon. One can walk toward it, and the horizon stays ahead. In the next part, the investigation returns to the oldest impulse beneath all these strands, the desire to believe that somewhere beyond the wind, there's a version of the world that has not yet been damaged by time. The corridor ahead is quiet. The archive is almost empty. What remains is the shape of longing itself, and the question of what it does to history. There is a particular kind of longing that attaches itself to origins. It is not always curiosity. Sometimes it is grief. Sometimes it is fatigue. Sometimes it is the quiet wish that the world once existed in a cleaner form, before compromise, before loss, before the endless accumulation of damage. Hyperborea, in the Greek imagination, carries that wish like a sealed vessel. It is a place where people are said to live near the divine, where suffering is distant, where the wind that punishes the ordinary world is left behind. This longing can be read as escapism. It can also be read as diagnosis. When a culture imagines a blessed land beyond reach, it reveals something about what it feels it lacks. The Greeks lived in a world of city rivalries, warfare, slavery, and fragile harvests. They also lived in a world of beauty and thought. Their myths often placed perfection elsewhere, beyond a boundary, across the sea, beneath the earth, in the age before. Hyperborea is one of those elsewhere places, and its direction, north, adds a strange austerity to the dream. It is not lush. It is not tropical. It is a paradise imagined in the cold, which suggests that the paradise is not a matter of comfort, but of purity. When early modern map makers drew polar structures, they were not necessarily longing for purity. They were longing for coherence. The globe had to make sense. The poles could not remain blank. A blank pole felt like a wound in the intellect. So the pole was furnished with land, channels, and central features that promised intelligibility. The later erasure of those features, as exploration corrected speculation, is a reminder that the longing for coherence can be stronger than the evidence at hand. When modern audiences look at prehistoric monuments in northern regions, the longing shifts again. It becomes a longing for depth. These stones are older than many familiar origin myths. They suggest that human sophistication has roots deeper than classical texts. They offer a kind of comfort that human beings have always been capable of meaning making, of building for the sky, of sealing chambers that catch the sun on a precise day. But they also bring discomfort. We cannot ask the builders what they meant. Their meanings are sealed behind time. The corridor into their minds is narrow and full of echoes. Climate history adds another kind of longing, the longing for what was physically lost. Submerged landscapes, shifting coastlines, vanished ecosystems. These are real erasures. They create genuine gaps in the archaeological record. They also create emotional gaps. The sense that entire chapters of human life took place on lands that now lie beneath water or were ground away by ice. To say we do not know in such cases is not a failure of scholarship. It is an honest recognition of how the planet edits its own archives. Linguistics and genetics can intensify longing in an unexpected way. By showing connection, they reveal that origin is not a simple line. Many people want a single route. The evidence often offers multiple routes and multiple crossings. This can feel like disorientation, yet it also offers a quieter truth that human history is relational. It is a web, not a pillar. Hyperborea, with its image of a single blessed homeland, can feel attractive precisely because it offers a pillar where evidence offers a web. This is why the investigation has insisted on restraint. Hyperborea can be used as a symbol of purity, of coherence, of depth, of loss. It can be used as a banner. The responsible approach is to keep returning to what the sources actually do and do not say. The sources do not give coordinates. They do not give a stable ethnography. They do not give a material culture that can be excavated and labeled. They give motifs beyond the north wind, offerings in relay, a connection to Apollo, a people imagined as blessed, a place that resists verification. At the same time, the broader story of the North, independent of Hyperborea, does contain real rewrites of human origins. The evidence that humans adapted to cold regions early, that migrations crossed vast corridors, that landscapes changed dramatically, that prehistoric monuments in northern latitudes were built with sophistication. These are genuine revisions of older simplistic narratives. They show that the edge is often where the story becomes most interesting, not because it hides a single secret, but because it forces the mind to accept complexity. So what? In the end, does the name Hyperborea reveal? It reveals how a culture names the unknown. It reveals how the unknown becomes sacred. It reveals how the sacred becomes drawn as if it were geographic. It reveals how drawn geography can later be erased, leaving behind a memory of certainty that never deserved it. It reveals how modern science can both satisfy and intensify the hunger for origins, satisfying by providing evidence, intensifying by showing how much still cannot be known. There is also a deeper revelation that the very act of looking for origins changes the seeker. The more one searches, the more one learns that origins are rarely singular. They are often multiple beginnings, layered beginnings, beginnings that do not agree with each other. A myth offers a single beginning because it must. A scientific model can tolerate multiple beginnings because it can update. A human heart, however, often wants one. Hyperborea, then, stands at an intersection between heart and method. It is a name that can be held as poetry without being treated as proof. It can be held as a reminder that the archive has edges. It can be held as a caution about the allure of filling gaps with certainty. The corridor now approaches its last door. The investigation cannot end with a final answer because the evidence does not offer one. It can end only with a shift in perspective. From where was Hyperborea to why do humans keep placing beginnings beyond reach? The North, with its pivoting sky and its severe thresholds, is one of the most natural places to place such beginnings. In the final movement, the inquiry returns to the pole not as a destination, but as a symbol of orientation, a point that can be approached but never fully possessed. It will leave the name Hyperborea where it has always lived best, at the edge of the map, where the ink fades, where certainty loosens, and where the turning stars suggest that even the most fixed points are part of a larger motion. If Hyperborea has been anything across the long reach of recorded thought, it has been a direction more than a location. It is a finger lifted toward a pale horizon, a gesture that says, beyond that, something begins. In Greek language, it is beyond the north wind, and the wind itself is already a boundary, already a force that stings the eyes and makes the body fold inward. To go beyond the wind is to go beyond the ordinary conditions of being human. That is why the name keeps returning. It is not satisfied with the human scale, and yet the human scale is where evidence lives. Evidence is made of things that survive: stone, bone, wood stained in soil, pigments trapped in caves, words copied onto new pages, numbers encoded in genomes. These survivals are partial. They do not arrange themselves into perfect narratives. They arrive unevenly, like objects washed ashore after a storm. The mind that wants a single origin sees these objects and imagines the ship that must have carried them. Sometimes the ship existed. Sometimes there were many ships. Sometimes the objects drifted from different coasts and never belonged to the same vessel at all. Hyperborea invites the idea of a single vessel, a single blessed land, a single corridor of offerings from the edge to the center, a single north that holds what the rest of the world has lost. It is an old solution to a problem that never goes away: the problem of incompleteness. The archive is incomplete. Memory is incomplete. Even science, which measures and tests, is incomplete because it depends on what can be found and what can be sampled and what can be preserved. The North is an amplifier of this incompleteness. Ice and water both erase and protect. Coasts vanish beneath rising seas. Permafrost locks time away and then, in warmer cycles, releases it. The very ground behaves like a gatekeeper, sometimes sealing corridors, sometimes opening them without warning. If there is any restricted access in the human story, it is often geological. A buried landscape is not refusing us out of intention, it is refusing us out of physics. And still, the mind returns to the pole. There is a reason the pole feels different from other directions. East and west are horizons of sunrise and sunset, daily drama that repeats. South can be warmth and abundance in many climates. North, in the northern hemisphere, can become a hinge, the point around which the night sky seems to turn. Even without technical knowledge, the eye can sense rotation. Stars rise, arc, and fall, and yet some seem to circle without setting, holding a quiet vigil. Over time, that vigil suggests a center. A center suggests an origin. A fixed point suggests a truth that does not drift. But the fixed point is not fixed. Precession slowly changes the sky's alignment over millennia. The pole star of one epoch is not the pole star of another. Even what seems stable is part of a larger cycle. The heavens, which once looked like an unchanging dome, are revealed by time to be a moving system. The symbolic center is still useful, but it is no longer absolute. This is where Hyperborea becomes most human. Not as a lost kingdom, not as an archaeological site waiting under ice, but as a symbol of the desire to find a stable center in a world that changes. The Greeks placed a blessed land beyond the wind. Early modern mapmakers drew elegant polar architectures. Modern minds, confronted with deep time and shifting migrations, look for a name that can hold the feeling of an ancestral before. Hyperborea offers that holding. The investigation has walked through many rooms where the name echoes, through ancient texts that hesitate, through maps that once claimed certainty and later withdrew it, through stone corridors that catch solstice light, through climate histories that swallow coasts, through the careful mathematics of language change, through the quiet revelations of DNA. None of these rooms contains a sign that reads Hyperborea, and perhaps that is the point. The name is not a label on a door, it is the sound of knocking. A myth can be understood as an instrument, not a statement. It measures the shape of longing. It reveals what a culture wants to be true. It also reveals what a culture cannot prove but cannot stop thinking about. Hyperborea measures the longing for a world that is both distant and pure, both real enough to imagine and unreachable enough to remain uncontaminated by disappointment. In a sleep-soft hour, it is possible to see the name as a kind of compass. Not a compass that leads to a specific latitude, but a compass that points toward the edge of what can be said responsibly. When the record grows quiet, the compass still points. It points into blankness. It points into the place where the archive ends and interpretation begins. It points into the place where every answer becomes a choice of what to believe. The most honest posture before such a compass is not to declare the destination, but to notice the pointing. North, in this sense, becomes less a direction on earth and more a direction in thought, toward what is not fully graspable, toward what seems to hold still while everything else moves, toward the illusion of permanence that helps a fragile creature endure. Hyperborea is that illusion made gentle. It is a promise that beyond hardship, there is a chamber where suffering does not enter, a chamber sealed from the noise of history. And if that chamber is not on the map, it may still exist where symbols exist, in the turning of the sky, in the patience of stone, in the way light returns after long dark, in the way the mind insists on seeking beginnings even when beginnings are braided and drifting and incomplete. The north wind rises, and beyond it, the page remains pale, not because the story is being withheld, but because the world is larger than any story can hold. In that pale space, the name Hyperborea continues to hover like a distant star, useful not as an address, but as a reminder that every map, no matter how detailed, still ends somewhere, and that beyond the end there is always the same quiet invitation to look up, to orient, and to accept that the center of the turning sky is both a point and a question,